Hello, we are the representatives of Amphitheater High School in Tucson, Arizona. We'd like to thank you for being with us today. Thank you, Avi.
Thank you.
Welcome.
We'd also like to thank the Pima County Public Library, the Arizona Public Media, our teachers, and the listeners to this recording. I'm Kenley.
I'm Nicole.
I'm Arlette.
I'm Greg.
Okay, so for our first question, in your dedication at the very beginning of your recent book, Gold Rush Girl, you said that this book was for Isabella and Zeke. Do you mind if we pry into who this is?
That's two of my grandchildren.
Ah, okay.
And Isabella is the oldest, and she has a younger brother named Ezekiel, or Zeke. And I just thought I'd dedicate it to them. Not for any particular purpose, but it's fun to dedicate the books to whom people you're fond of.
Thank you.
Thank you.
They don't even have the book yet. I just sent it to them.
Okay, all right. So, something I noticed throughout the book was the reference to the novel Jane Eyre. Victoria takes the quotes, "My will shall decide my destiny," and "I'd rather be happy than dignified" throughout her journey. How are Eyre and Victoria connected?
Well, it's not so much that they are the same, if I'm understanding your question. Like many times when you read a book, it's not so much that you can say, oh, I'm just like that character, that happens. But more often than not, it's a shared experience. And if you've ever read Jane Eyre, the book begins by her being very badly treated by her aunt, Jane Eyre being an orphan. And so in my book, Tori identifies very closely with Jane Eyre's mistreatment. And since she can then bond with the character, she goes forward by reading the book. One thing you need to know is when the book was first published in 1847 in the United States, it was published, if you will, anonymously, and somebody like Tori would not know if it's fiction or nonfiction. So she just absorbs the book as experience. And she takes strength from that story as Jane Eyre in the book develops great individuality and strength. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. Thank you. That
Okay.
definitely helped me understand a little more.
Okay. Since the book takes place in the 1850s, what inspired you to choose this time period instead of somewhere else?
Well, actually, what I suggest you do, I would go to my blog site, and there's a whole lot of stuff now about how that book came to be. The short answer to that is, I was visiting in San Francisco, and I saw some rather extraordinary photographs. And the photographs were of hundreds of sailing ships in San Francisco Bay that had been abandoned. And the reason they were abandoned is that when gold was discovered, people came to San Francisco from all over the world. And of course, the people who came went in search of gold, but the crews of the ships left to search for gold. These boats were just abandoned, and there were hundreds of them. And the picture was sort of spooky and fascinating, and I began to read about them and learn about them. And then gradually I began to develop an idea as I read about San Francisco in those early days. It was a very wild place. And part of what I learned is that these ships, when they were abandoned by the crews, the captains often resorted to stealing people to sail their ships home. So if you put all that together, you see how this idea for the book developed.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Greg. This
Hey,
question is a little bit more general, but what is it about historical fiction as a genre that has you coming back to it over and over again as an author?
Well, at my age, I'm sort of historical fiction myself. There's that. Well, I've always loved to read history, and I love the stories that we find in history. And I would say there's another thing. My own children, and I have 5 of them, I think, but they're all adults. I don't get to spend a great deal of time with young folks. So I tend to invent them in my head, and one of the ways you can do that is through historical fiction. So young people today, of course, if you read young adult literature, contemporary, it's full of slang, various ways of getting along and so forth. I'm not terribly conversant with those anymore. But if I go back in time, I can, if you will, do the research and invent the very people that I'd like to write about. Does that help explain it?
Yes, thank you.
Hi, I'm Arlette. What does a day of writing look like to you?
Hard. I don't know, I get up, I wake up, I'm in bed, and I'm thinking, okay, where am I in this current project? And I'll give you an example of today. I mean, I wake up and I'm working on a new book. It has to do with the American Revolution. And I need to get my character, so to speak, from place A to place B. What has to happen for that to occur? And so I'm thinking, do I have to go back and readjust something I did in the earlier pages of the book, or should I just go forward? Wait a minute, that's not really clear, think it through. Okay, so I have a plan, slight plan. I get up, have my cup of coffee, I sit down, and then usually start by going back to what I had written yesterday. I make it better. I clarify some of the problems that I was working on, and then I sort of inch forward. And then I go back and rewrite what I've just done. And then I go back and rewrite something that existed on page 10, and so forth. So it's back and forth, always going forward a little bit at a time. So I worked most of the morning, took a walk, came back, tried to figure out what we were doing. And after we finish up, I'll go back because I think I know what I have to do next. So it's pretty much all day. It's not as if I'm handcuffed to the computer, but it's in my head all day, and probably when I go to bed at night, I'll read a book that, some sort of historical work that touches on this part of the revolution I'm writing about, and see what I can pick up. And sometimes I will read something, and here's an example of it. I was reading a letter that had been written at the precise time that I was writing about, and the letter was not terribly interesting until I got to the last line, and the letter writer said, "I just heard the evening gun. I have to sign over." And I'm thinking, what is the evening gun? And so the next morning, I did research and found out what the evening gun is. The evening gun it's a military thing that at sunset, they lower the flag, and in honor of that flag, they shoot off a cannon. That's the evening gun. It signals the beginning of nighttime. And I like that. It sort of has an interesting touch to it, and I made sure I put it in the book. So that's the way it works.
Okay.
Or I'll give you another example. One character asks another, have you ever done such and such? And the character says, no, N-O-P-E, no. And I said, wait a minute, that sounds very modern. And I have an historical dictionary which tells me when words entered into the English language. The word nope doesn't come into American English until the 19th century. So here I am writing about the 18th century, so I have to take that word out and substitute a word that is used in that time. So that happens all the time when I'm working.
So we kind of have had half answers from this, but what sources do you use for getting information when you're writing a book, like background knowledge, historical context?
Well, let me begin by, before I could make a living as a writer, I worked as a librarian for 20 years. And I used to work in a reference librarian, and I used to teach students how to do research. And so I'm pretty good at doing research and learning how to get information. And if we had the time, it wouldn't take very long. I could teach everyone how to do research. It's not very difficult. It takes time. And in fact, the internet has made doing research very much easier than it should be. Not because I get information from the internet, I don't. But I get access to books through the internet, either interlibrary loan, I'm constantly using interlibrary loan, or used books and things like that. Getting information on a topic can be difficult, but certain subjects, like the American Revolution, the problem is not finding the information, but there's so much information that it's hard to pick and choose. That's true for San Francisco and the Gold Rush. There's a huge, huge amount of information about it. Now, on the other hand, I also wrote a book some years ago about the Colorado Gold Rush, which takes place about 10 years after the California Gold Rush. Much harder to find information. That's the way it is. But it's not that hard, and I really enjoy it. The way I usually begin an historical novel, being the librarian that I really am, I assemble a library of books on the subject. That's the first thing I do. And as I work, I'm going back to those books. Is that true? Did I get that right? Check it again and again. And I have my own library as it were. I've never stopped being a librarian. I just write books that I put on the library shelf.
Okay, so there's a quote in chapter 23. Don't even try to tell me anything about slavery. White folks think slavery is just about black people. Don't you believe it? Can you expand on that?
Sure. I wrote a book about that. It's called The Unexpected Life of Oliver Cromwell Pitt. In England and in the United States, particularly in England in the early 18th century, if you were found guilty of a crime, one of the standard punishments was to send you to the colonies, and you had to do enforced labor for 7, 14, or 21 years. And in the early colonies, something like 50,000 people were sent to the colonies as punishment. And this was certainly a form of slavery. You were basically owned by the person who took charge of you. So that happened, and then there was something called indentured servitude, in which if you, say, lived in England and you wanted to get to the Americas, you signed a contract that said, in exchange for transportation, I'll work for you for any number of years. And the conditions for indentured servants, for felons, as they were called, were pretty horrible. If you read that book, The Unexpected Life of Oliver Cromwell Pitts, you'll see how that went down. And there's a sequel to that. It's called The End of the World and Beyond, about what life was like as a felon. In this case, the book is set in Maryland in the 18th century. And even today, in prisons, prisoners are often required to work. I remember when I was a kid traveling through the South, I saw chain gangs and so forth and so on. So there's all kinds of involuntary servitude. And in some ways, yes, it exists even today. Does that help you?
Yeah, that did. Thank you.
It's really fascinating and awful, but it's true.
In your book, you post Sam, who is a black man. What is Sam's purpose in the story? Like, why'd you put him in?
Why did I put him in?
Yeah.
First of all, it adds texture to the story. But I am of the opinion that racism in our country is a fundamental aspect about how we live and work and deal with other people. And when I can, I like to reference it in my books. In the story, he's crucial because he knows how the kidnapping works. He knows who's doing it, and there's no way for the girl to know that without someone telling him. And the boy, Sam, has a brother who's been kidnapped, so he knows all about this nefarious scheme, and he can tell Tori, and that makes it believable to her, and just adds a dimension to the story, explains life as it was. I think it just adds to the story. That's basically it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you cleared it up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Between your first book and Gold Rush Girl, what, if anything, has changed about your writing process?
You're talking about 80 books. I think there are a couple of things. There's some mechanical things. So when I began to write, I worked on a manual typewriter. And nowadays I work on a computer. It's much easier to write on a computer. You can revise your work faster. You can add to the complexity of a book with much greater ease. I like to think I write a more complex kind of story, but I don't know. I'll tell you, the reader is the best person to answer that question. So just read all 80 and then you could answer that question best.
Sounds good.
I don't really know the answer to that. I like to think I'm getting better, but that doesn't always happen. So I like to think I haven't written my best book yet. So we'll see. The thing is, writing is not consistent. I like to think I'm a good writer, but one doesn't always, at least speaking for myself, I don't always know what I'm doing. It's very intuitive. I'm trying to find my way. I'm trying to tell a good story. I rewrite my books 70, 80 times before they're done. And even then, they're not perfect. There's not a book I've written that I suspect I could not make better if I went back into it. I'm sure that's the case. So I don't really know. Maybe I have a sort of notion. I have to acknowledge the fact that I'm a successful writer. And I like to say that my successes give me the patience to work through my failures. I like to think if I work hard enough, long enough, I can write a good book. But believe me, there are times I get very frustrated and say, quit, why don't you quit this business? It's too hard, it's not worth it. So.
Thank
Okay,
you.
Thank you.
My question is, did you ever look to your grandfathers for inspiration?
No, I don't think so. It was my mother's father who liked to talk American history with me. He was, like many immigrants, became intensely patriotic and liked to talk to me about American history. So maybe that influenced me. Probably did.
From all of your books, which one of the settings, like time periods or locations, would you like to visit the most? Like, which one seems most appealing to you?
I really don't know. I joke about saying you should read all of my books and decide for yourself, but it's really true. I mean, I write for readers. I don't write for myself. So it's very tricky to ascertain or make a judgment as to what's best or what's... I really don't know. I really don't know. And since I don't know anybody in the world who's read all of my books, I don't know if it even matters. So, you just try to do what you can. Maybe it's the books that sell the most, but I don't even think that's necessarily true. I have a number of bestsellers. Who's to say what? In any case, I mean, you read a book, you enjoy it for your reasons. Somebody else reads another book for another reason. It's not that one is right and one is wrong. Everybody approaches the book in their own way, and they can make their own judgments. And it's not even a judgment. It's just, I enjoyed reading it. That's as good as you can get.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
My question is, the name Victoria or Tori, is that symbolic in any way?
No, you just try to find a name that's somehow resonant for the time period, the culture. Victoria, after all, the Queen of England at that time was Queen Victoria. And one would think that a lot of people admired her in one sense or another and would like to name a child after such a person. That's just the way I was thinking.
Okay.
What made you choose a female main character over, say, a male one?
I would say that in telling this story, it creates a whole different kind of tension, knowing that this is a girl doing what she does. In one sense, you're absolutely right. It could have been told from a male perspective. But at this time in our culture, in our history, I just thought it would be more fun to tell it from a girl's point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
She takes more risks. She's going to a city where there are almost no women, no girls. And that adds to the whole dimension of the story, I hope.
Okay. In your writing career, what has been your happiest moment?
The happiest moment in my writing career?
Yeah.
I would say, I wouldn't say one moment. I would say it's completing a first draft of a book. I've worked on it for 6 to 7, 8 months, maybe more. And I have a great sense of relief when I've reached that point, because I love to rewrite. And when you get a first draft, then the fun of writing really takes place. So the happiest moment, I would say, is when I get a first draft of a book.
Thank you.
When writing historic books with historic elements, what have you found to be your favorite event or bit of information that has happened? It can be comedic or just you thought that was pretty cool.
Well, having written as much as I have, you become aware, I think, of knowing, oh, that's good, that's going to work. And by the same token, oh, this is no good. So those are the hard parts when you say, this isn't working, why? What can I do to make this a better read? But you get these moments, oh, that's good, I like that. The thing about writing this is very hard to write, and to write well is even harder. If you think about the world of writing, and think about, you study writing in school, you study literature, think how many really great books there are. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of books written, but they're not thousands and thousands of great books. They're relatively few. It's because it's so hard. How do you write a book that connects with many, many people over many, many years? It's really quite rare. It's a very rare thing. We think of it, here you're in a library at the moment that's full of books. How many of them are actually read? How many of them are enjoyed? Hopefully all of them are read, but some of them are obviously read more than others. Why? What makes a book resonate with a lot of people? It's rather mysterious. I've written books that I thought were not very good, and that people think they're very good. People understand it. On the other hand, I write a book that I think is good, and then folks say, well, it's not really very good. How did that happen? It's very complicated. What's to say, what is good writing? You compare, say, here, 2 extreme examples. Charles Dickens, the English novelist. He writes very, very big books, complex books, wordy books. Then you pick up someone like the American writer, Ernest Hemingway, very spare, at least he tries to be, very direct. And yet people enjoy those books by different authors. Why does one work and why does the other not work? Or why do they both work? I can't answer that. And I guess it's not necessary. But how does it all work? Writing is sort of mysterious, I think.
Okay.
How would you, any of you, tell me, what is it that makes good writing work? What do you feel is good writing?
I would say that good writing is what speaks to the reader.
But which reader?
It's very subjective, isn't it?
It's highly individualistic, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
And how come a given work can speak directly to so many different readers? But I agree with you, it has to reach the reader. I have this sort of mantra, a belief, and I'll quote it to myself all the time. Writers don't write writing, they write reading. In other words, when I write something, it's not for myself, it's for you to understand. But I don't know you, so how can I do that?
How do you know when you have researched a subject or time period enough to start writing?
Well, I write and do research simultaneously. I was talking to my wife just last night, and she was asking me about something that I was writing, this book I am. And she said, well, what would they eat at that time? And I like to think I know, but then I said, wait a minute, do I really know that? And then you go back and do more research. So it's not as if I do all the research and then write, because there are some writers who always write about the same period of time. And I envy them because then they become real experts in that period. I don't do that, unfortunately. I go from time to time, and then I have to do the research all over again. So you never finish with the research. There's always something new to learn, always.
Who do you have in mind as your reader?
One of the things that I like to do when I finish a book, or get close to finishing it, I like to go to a school and read it to, say, 5th, 6th, or 7th graders. And by doing that, I remind myself who my readers are. It's not one person in particular, it's in general. And when I had kids of my own, who were younger, that is to say, I could think very specifically. I remember I went to one of my son's classes to read a book, and what happened is he came home, and I guess he was embarrassed to tell me when he went up to his mother and he said, "Dad read this book, it really isn't very good."
Oh, wow.
And he told her why, and she told me, of course. So I talked to him about it, and he was right. And I went back and rewrote the book. That much better. So. But I don't have young people, or my grandchildren don't live near me anymore, so I wish they did. But for example, I mean, we're talking because I was to come to the Tucson Book Festival, and then I was going to go on to California to visit a whole bunch of schools. And it was really important to me. I had to cancel the whole thing, like everything was canceled. But I was really looking forward to being with young people and my readers and talking to them and reminding myself who my readers were. So one of the casualties of this pandemic is I'm cut off from my readers. Not so good.
When you ever find yourself in a writer's block, have you ever talked to somebody or called somebody to get yourself out of it?
When people talk about writer's block, they're perhaps not aware that they're talking about two different things which have the same name. There is the writer's block that is simply, oops, I don't know what comes next. I think I'll go take a walk and think this out. That happens to me 20 times a day. Then there's the more serious mental condition, which happily has not happened to me, in which the writer becomes frightened of what they're writing, for whatever reasons, too real, too strange, too close to reality that he or she has experienced, and they sort of freeze up and can't write. And that's a sort of form of depression, if you will. And happily, I've never had that problem. The other kind of problem, trying to figure out what happens next, is constant, and it's part of the process of writing. And it's important that you mention that, because lots of young writers, when they get stuck, and that's what we're talking about, think, I can't do this, it's too hard. But getting stuck is part of the process, and you just have to think it through. If you put it this way, that thinking is what you do most of the time when you're writing, not actually writing. And then maybe that helps you.
So you've spoken today about how most of the time you write for the readers and not for yourself. But this question is, if you had to choose one piece of your own writing, popularity aside, that you believe truly represents you or what you wish to convey to your readers, which is it?
I would say I have no idea. I truly don't.
Well, going back on the topic of the process of writing, what would you say you have the hardest time, and like what aspect of writing? Would it be building the setting, building a character, building conversation, or just generally progressing the story?
Well, let me put it in a very different way. When you write a novel, which is what I do most of the time, there has to be something intensely logical about the whole thing. That is to say that one incident, one moment follows the other in such a way that the reader can follow the progression, not just of the story, but of the character and the situation. And it has to be done in such a language, with a language, that evokes the situation. There's a famous quote by a American British writer named Henry James that's, and I quote it, "Don't tell, show. Don't tell, show." And the idea is that you don't want to say, oh, so-and-so was a grumpy person. You want to demonstrate through the action of the story that this person is grumpy. That is to say, the reader understands that through the experience of relating and reading about that character. So you have to put all of these different elements together. And that's the hard part of it. You want the language to be evocative. You want the situations to be strong and clear. You want the characters to be real. You're doing all of these things at once. It's exhausting just to talk about it. And that's why it's so hard. You're thinking about all of this stuff simultaneously. And you can't. So you go back over and over and over the book again. And, there's some little quirky things. I'm very conscious of language in my books. I try not to repeat language, words. I try to find the right word. I spend a lot of time with the words. I remember a writer I met once who said, if I could write one really great sentence, I'd be happy with my writing life. And I understand that. To write a sentence that resonates and that people capture and hold is a very, very, very difficult thing to do. And I don't know if I've done it. I like to think I've tried. But I know this sounds like I'm making writing so terribly difficult. It's wonderful fun. That's make it easy. You have to really like it.
Okay. Somewhat on the same topic, you mentioned show, not tell. Something I found really interesting in this story was how well you depicted the perspective of a little girl. How did you go about that? Do you want to add on to that?
Sure. My mother was a feminist, and she raised her children to be feminist. And one of the parts about learning about feminism is that you learn that being a boy, being a girl, being a woman, being a man is, of course, biology, but a lot of it is culture. And there's a culture of being a girl. There's a culture of being a boy. And one needs to learn it and know it. It's a matter of course that, for example, women know much more about men than men know about women. And that's because men in our society, being powerful, have not bothered to think they needed to know about women. And what I'm trying to suggest to you, you have to be conscious of this. And once you're conscious of this, then you're not so locked out by these differences. And of course there are differences, but so many of them are cultural rather than biological. And once you accept that, it's not so hard to learn and be observant, and therefore you can write about it. Does that help?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
You know, it's we look with our eyes, and there's the biology of the eyes, but how we see things is often cultural. Let me give you a very trite example of that. I used to do this experiment with kids in a classroom. I'd say to a classroom of boys and girls, write down all the variations of the color blue. How many variations of the color blue can you think of? And what do you think would be the result of asking that question?
Dark blue.
Girls were able to give many more words for the color blue. Is that because girls' eyes are different than boys' eyes? No. But because they've been taught to think about fashion and color, whereas boys are not. So the girls see more variations in the color blue, not because they see differently, but they're able to name what those variations are. Do the boys see those variations? Absolutely. But they don't differentiate them in terms of their words.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you know, there's this cliche, I don't even know if it's true, among the Inuit people, the Eskimo people, there are 27 words for the color white because of snow. Is that true? I really don't know, but it's perfectly logical. It makes sense to me. You know, and again, it's cultural, not biological.
Okay, thank you.
This question is a little bit kooky, I guess, but do you read for pleasure as an author?
Absolutely.
Who are your favorite authors, and what sort of genres are they?
I read very randomly. I don't have, I mean, if I'm doing research, then I know what I'm doing. But otherwise, I pick up a book maybe because I like the cover or the title, or because my wife says, you really ought to read this. Well, I don't have a program for my pleasure reading. I just like to read. And if I like the book, I keep reading. If I don't like it, I stop reading. But I'm a browser in bookstores and libraries. I just go for what catches my interest, and I can't give you a concrete pattern or system to that. There are certain writers, obviously, that I like, not because even they're good, but because I find their stories entertaining. But everybody reads that way to some degree. So I don't have a systematic And I can tell you favorite authors of mine, you know, but I don't know if that tells you anything. And it doesn't mean to say that you're going to like them either. Right? Reading is very highly individualistic, I think.
Right.
Well, Avi, just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.